Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. Elias Ward spent most days alone on his ranch, a few miles from the nearest town and far enough from the main trails that strangers rarely passed by. He had chosen this isolation years earlier. After losing his younger brother in a range accident, he blamed himself for. The distance from people had become a kind of shield. Work filled the hours, and silence filled everything else. His life was predictable. Repair fences, tend the horses, keep the land in order. It was a routine that didn't demand explanations or require him to talk more than a few words a day. That afternoon, he had been checking the northern fence line. Two posts had shifted after the last rain, and the ground there always softened first. Fixing it wasn't urgent, but he never liked leaving a problem for later. As he worked, he heard the steady sound of water moving faster than usual. Nothing strange for a frontier creek, but louder than he remembered. It pushed through the quiet enough to make him look up. Elias wasn't a man who followed every sound, but he knew the land well. If something changed, he noticed. He wiped sweat from his forehead, adjusted his worn hat, and walked toward the noise with slow, deliberate steps. The creek was a few minutes away through a stand of scrub oak. As he approached, another sound blended with the rush of water, a faint splash, too controlled to be an animal tumbling in. He stopped and listened, instincts tightening his chest. He had grown used to solitude. Unexpected noise put him on alert. For a moment, he considered turning around. He didn't want trouble, but something in the rhythm of the splash wasn't wild or chaotic. It sounded human. He moved closer, cautious but calm. When he reached the edge of the brush, he froze. A young Apache woman stood knee-deep in the creek, her back turned to him. She was rinsing mud from her arms, moving stiffly as though every motion cost her strength. Her clothes, what remained of them, were torn and clinging to her skin. Her shoulders shook from cold. When she shifted slightly, he saw the bruises along her side and the dirt embedded in cuts that hadn't been treated. Elias felt his throat tighten. She wasn't there by choice. He stepped back instinctively, making sure his boots shifted loudly in the gravel so he wouldn't startle her. She spun toward him anyway, breath catching her chest. Her eyes were sharp and terrified, ready to bolt or fight, depending on what he did next. Elias lifted both hands slowly, palms open, showing he held no weapon. "All right," he said in a low, steady voice. "Just passing through." He watched her jaw clench. She didn't understand all his words, but she understood tone. She stayed still, muscles tensed, waiting for a move that might force her to defend herself. Elias took a breath, thinking fast. He wasn't supposed to involve himself. He knew what people said about ranchers who sheltered the wrong stranger. But leaving her like this, alone, cold, hurt, felt wrong deep in his ribs. He saw desperation in her posture and exhaustion in the way she leaned slightly to one side, favoring her leg. He swallowed hard and forced himself to look away so she wouldn't feel cornered. Nearby, a flat rock sat half in the shade. He pulled a clean cloth from his saddlebag, walked toward the rock slowly, and placed it down. "You can use that," he said quietly. "I'll go." He didn't wait for a reaction. He turned and walked back through the brush the way he came, his heart beating faster than he cared to admit. The image of her trembling in the water stayed fixed in his mind, someone who had survived something harsh and was barely holding on. He knew the Apache bands around the region. He knew the territories, the conflicts, the brutality some raider groups unleashed. Whoever she was, she hadn't wandered here by accident. Elias didn't go straight home. He lingered near the corral, checking the barn door even though it didn't need checking. His thoughts stayed on the woman at the creek. He wondered if she could walk. He wondered if she had food. He wondered if leaving her alone had been the safest choice or the most foolish thing he'd done in years. By sundown, the temperature dipped sharply. Elias lit his lantern, planning to finish mending tack before turning in. But something tugged at him, a quiet, persistent worry he couldn't shake. He stepped outside, scanned the shadows near the barn, and paused. A small figure lay collapsed near the outer wall, barely moving. A chill ran through him. He set the lantern down and crouched beside her. It was the same woman from the creek. Her breathing was shallow, her skin cold, and her eyes unfocused. She had tried to stay away, but her strength had failed before she reached the open fields. Elias hesitated only a second. Then he lifted her carefully into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, too light. She didn't resist, just shivered weakly against his chest. "Easy," he murmured. "You're all right." He carried her into the cabin, placed her near the fire, and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She opened her eyes once, confused, unsure whether he meant harm. Elias kept his distance, kneeling a few steps away. "You're safe," he said quietly. "Warm up. No one's going to touch you." He saw fear fading slowly in her expression, replaced by cautious awareness. She didn't speak, but her gaze followed every move he made. Elias didn't know her name, her story, or how long she had been running. But he understood one thing with absolute clarity. She had no strength left, and he was the only person who could keep her alive tonight. For the first time in years, Elias felt the weight of responsibility settle on him again, not as a burden, but as a choice he had to make. This woman had crossed into his life by chance, but what happened next depended on him. He took a slow breath. He wasn't going to let her die on his land. Elias waited a moment before moving again, letting the woman see that he wasn't going to crowd her or force her to speak. The firelight flickered across the cabin's rough wooden walls, giving the room a steady warmth. She watched every shift in his posture, alert even through her exhaustion. Her breathing was shallow, and he could tell she was fighting to stay conscious, trying to judge whether she was safer inside his home or outside in the cold. He set a tin cup of warm water near her, not close enough to make her feel pressured. Then he stepped back and leaned against the table, giving her space to look around the room. She slowly pushed herself upright, wincing at the soreness in her ribs. Elias kept his hands visible and still. He understood that any sudden movement could push her back into panic. The first chapter had left some questions hanging: who she was, where she had come from, whether she had been chased, and how badly she was injured. Now, seeing her in the firelight, Elias took stock of those answers with quiet concern. Her arms and legs showed weeks of travel. The cuts weren't fresh, but had been left untreated too long. The bruises on her side weren't from a fall. They were from a hard strike. Someone had hit her with purpose. "You're hurt," Elias said softly, not as a question, but as an observation. She blinked slowly, struggling to form words. "No, no hurt," she whispered in broken English, even though the pain in her face contradicted her claim. He shook his head gently. "I'm not a skin to pry. Just want to know what you need." She looked down, gripping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. It wasn't shame, more like she didn't know if admitting weakness would put her at risk. Elias recognized the hesitation. He had seen it once before in a runaway boy he'd helped years earlier. Fear made people protect their wounds, not show them. After a few moments, she reached for the cup. Her fingers shook as she lifted it. She drank slowly, her throat working with effort. When she finished, she placed the cup down with care, as if she didn't want to make noise. Elias crouched a little, keeping his distance. "You got a name?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, eyes darting between him and the door. "Ayoka," she whispered. He nodded once. "Elias." Her gaze softened slightly. Names meant something. Names meant a person wasn't hiding an intention. The tension in her shoulders eased, just barely. But another question needed answering. How had she ended up alone in the water, half frozen, with no supplies and no protection? Ayoka glanced toward the window, as if expecting someone outside. Her breathing picked up, and her hand moved instinctively toward her hip where a knife might have been once. She had been carrying nothing when he found her. Whoever attacked her had taken everything. "You ran from someone," Elias said quietly, not pushing, just stating what he saw. "They close." Ayoka shook her head, but didn't speak. Then, after a long pause, she raised her eyes and pointed to the bruises along her rib. "Raiders," she whispered. "Men bad. Take horses. Take people." Her voice cracked on the last word. Elias's jaw tightened. He knew the type. Opportunistic riders who drifted between territories, taking advantage of anyone they could overpower. They had no tribe, no loyalty, no rules. If she'd escaped them, she had survived something brutal and barely slipped free. Did they follow you this far? He asked. Ayoka shook her head again, slower this time. Days, many days. No see them. But her eyes flicked to the door once more. Not safe. Elias understood. Just because she hadn't seen them didn't mean they weren't out there. Men like that traveled in loose circles, hunting the vulnerable and picking through land like wolves. He stood up and moved to the stove, giving her space again. He put water on to warm and set aside some dried meat to soften. He didn't know her diet, but anyone who had gone hungry long enough needed small portions, not a full meal all at once. Ayoka watched him, confused but not frightened. You help? She asked, the words heavy with doubt. Yeah, Elias said simply. You don't owe me for it. You stay until you can walk steady. After that, you choose where to go. Her eyes widened slightly, surprised he wasn't claiming her safety as leverage. She expected bargaining or conditions. Instead, he offered choice. Real choice. Something she hadn't had since the raiders caught her band on the trail weeks earlier. She wrapped the blanket closer, adjusting it with trembling hands. You good, man? She asked carefully. Elias didn't answer right away. He stared at the stove, at the dull glow beneath the iron plate. Don't know about that, he finally said. But I ain't the kind who hurts people who've already been hurt enough. Her gaze stayed on him for a long time. It wasn't admiration. It was relief mixed with uncertainty, like she wanted to believe him but couldn't afford to trust too easily. Elias walked to the other side of the room and dragged a spare cot near the fire. You sleep here tonight, he said, keeping his tone even. Fire will keep you warm. I'll stay near the door. She flinched, the word door bringing fresh fear. He saw it immediately. Not to watch you, he added quickly, just in case someone else is out there. Her shoulders lowered a little. She nodded once, settling onto the cot with care. She lay on her side, facing him, eyes open even as her body demanded rest. Elias recognized that look too. The body wanted sleep, but the mind refused. He sat in his chair near the door, arms resting on his knees, watching the flames dance inside the stove. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was simply two people adjusting to the presence of another human being after too long alone. Before her eyes finally closed, Ayoka whispered something. You find me why? Elias kept his gaze on the fire. Fence line was down, he said quietly. Only reason I went near the creek today. She breathed and shakily. Lucky, she whispered. He shook his head once. No, just timing. She fell asleep a minute later, exhaustion overtaking fear. Elias remained awake long after, thinking through everything unsaid. How far the raiders might be, whether someone would come looking, whether sheltering her put them both in danger. But every time he glanced at her resting by the fire, he knew he wouldn't have changed a thing. She was alive. She was safe, for tonight at least. And for now, that was enough. Elias woke before sunrise, as he always did, but this morning felt different. The cabin was quiet except for the steady crackle of the fire and the soft breathing coming from the cot. For a moment he remained still, letting his eyes adjust to the dim amber glow. Ayoka was curled under the blanket, her face half hidden, her posture tense even in sleep. She didn't rest like someone who felt safe. She rested like someone who expected to run again at any moment. Elias stood slowly, careful not to wake her. He added a small piece of wood to the stove, enough to keep the room warm without making a loud thud. The more practical questions from the earlier chapters pressed into his mind now. How injured she really was, how long she could stay, whether the raiders were anywhere near the property, and how much danger he was inviting onto his land by helping her. Ignoring these questions was no longer possible. When he stepped outside to check the barn, the morning air was cold enough to bite at his fingers. The sky was still a dark gray. He scanned the tree line out of habit, looking for fresh tracks or movement, but everything was still. Too still, he thought. He didn't like stillness that early. It meant the night hadn't finished letting go. Before he entered the barn, he paused, debating whether he needed to hide any tools or weapons inside the cabin. Not from Ayoka, but from anyone who might come looking. She had admitted raiders were involved. Raiders didn't leave unfinished business. If they had seen her escape, they might circle the region until they picked up her tracks. He rubbed the back of his neck, uneasy. He didn't want trouble, but trouble had a way of finding people who tried to avoid it. When he returned to the cabin, Ayoko was awake, sitting stiffly on the cot with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked around as though trying to understand where she was before her eyes settled on him. She pulled the blanket tighter, her knuckles whitening around the edge. "Morning," Elias said gently. He set down a small tin plate with warm cornbread and soft beans. "You need food before anything else." Ayoko watched his hands carefully, still unsure how close she could let him stand. Then she nodded once and reached for the plate. She ate slowly, cautious not to take too much or too fast. It wasn't fear of him. It was the instinct of someone who had gone long enough without meals that hunger became a threat, not a comfort. "I check outside," she said softly, pointing toward the door. "You go." Elias realized she had woken up expecting him to be gone, maybe believing he would leave her in the cabin alone or turn her out. "I was checking the barn," he answered. "Didn't want to wake you." She absorbed the explanation in silence, but her shoulders relaxed a little. A gap from the earlier chapters was now clearer. She needed reassurance not only that she was safe physically, but that she wouldn't be abandoned without warning. Someone had left her behind recently. Someone she trusted. Elias sat on the chair near the fire, keeping a respectful distance. "You're hurt more than you said," he said quietly. "You can barely sit straight without pain." Ayoka hesitated, her gaze dropping to her knees. "No show weakness," she murmured. "If show, they take." Elias understood more clearly. It wasn't just raiders. It was the broader reality of a woman traveling alone on the frontier. Weakness invited danger everywhere. "You don't have to hide anything from me," he said. "Not here." She looked at him with uncertainty, trying to decide whether to believe him. After a moment, she lifted her arm and showed a long gash on her side, half healed but swollen. Elias inhaled sharply. "You should have said something," he muttered, standing to get the small tin of salve from the shelf. She flinched when he approached, so he stopped halfway and crouched. "I'm not touching you unless you say it's all right," he said firmly. "You decide." Her breathing steadied. She stared at the wound, then at the salve in his hand. After thinking for a long moment, she nodded once. Slowly, measured, Elias approached carefully and applied the salve with the back of his knuckles, avoiding pressure. She winced, but didn't pull away. "You ran a long time," he said. "Too long to heal anything properly." Ayoka didn't answer, but tears gathered in the corners of her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, refusing to let them fall. Elias said nothing. He just sat back and stayed quiet while she regained her composure. When she could speak again, she lifted her chin with effort. "My family gone," she said. "Band attacked. Fire. I run. I no look back." This explained the emotional weight missing earlier. Her silence wasn't only fear, it was grief she had no space to process. Elias lowered his gaze. He knew grief. Knew what it looked like when someone tried to hold it together with nothing but raw will. "I'm sorry," he said sincerely. "No one should carry that alone." Ayoka wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. "You have family?" she asked. It was the first time she had asked him anything. Her voice carried careful curiosity, not intrusion. "No," Elias said. "Not anymore." She nodded, not out of politeness, but understanding. The fire cracked softly between them. Something shifted in the air. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of recognition. There were two people who had both lost more than they ever spoke about. Ayoka set down the empty plate and looked toward the window. "I stay here?" she asked. "One day." Elias shook his head. "You stay until you're strong enough to choose. I'm not turning you out." Her lungs released a slow, shaky breath, the kind that comes when someone stops bracing for the worst. But there was another question that needed answering, one left unspoken until now. "What if raiders come?" she whispered. Elias answered without hesitation. "Then we deal with them when they do. But you're not facing them alone again." Ayoka lowered her eyes, absorbing the promise quietly. It was not dramatic or exaggerated. It was spoken in the simple, steady tone of a man who meant exactly what he said. She lay back on the cot, finally letting her body rest properly. Elias stood near the door, scanning the land outside once more. He felt the weight of the responsibility settling in, but there was no regret. She needed safety, and he could provide it. For now, that was enough to keep both of them moving forward. And in the quiet morning light, the fragile beginning of trust took its first real shape. The morning settled into a calm that felt unfamiliar to both of them. Ayoka slept longer than before, her breathing steadier, her body finally allowing itself a small measure of rest. Elias watched the light shift across the floorboards while he cleaned a saddle strap at the table. He worked quietly, careful not to break the fragile sense of peace inside the cabin. It wasn't comfort yet, not for her and not for him, but the room no longer felt like a place of emergency. It felt like somewhere two wounded people were trying to catch their breath. Elias kept thinking about the questions that had hung over the earlier parts of the story. How she would navigate living with someone she barely knew, whether she understood how safe she truly was, and how the two of them would communicate now that silence alone couldn't carry everything. Chapter 4 had to close those gaps. They couldn't stay strangers sharing a roof without addressing the tension of daily life, their different cultures, or the practical realities of survival. When Ayoka finally stirred, Elias didn't move from his chair. He saw her blink against the morning light, pull the blanket close, and scan the room to confirm he hadn't left. That same fear of being abandoned, fear of being cornered, flickered behind her eyes before she pushed it down. She sat up carefully. Her side hurt less, but the stiffness in her posture showed she was still carrying more pain than she admitted. "You slept," Elias said evenly. Ayoka nodded, adjusting her hair with slow movements. Her braid had come undone, strands falling around her face. "Long sleep," she whispered, almost apologetic. "You needed it," he replied. "No reason to rush anything today." That reassurance seemed to soften her expression, but only slightly. Elias set aside the strap and stood. "You hungry?" She hesitated. She had eaten yesterday, but asking for more felt difficult for her. Part pride, part caution. "A little," she murmured. He served her a small portion of oats softened with warm milk. She accepted the bowl this time without watching his hands as closely. She sat near the fire again, eating slowly, testing the food with quiet appreciation. While she ate, Elias noticed something new. She wasn't only recovering from physical wounds. She was studying the cabin, mapping it out as if understanding the space would help her breathe easier. She checked the windows, the door latch, the tools hanging on the wall. She wasn't looking for means of escape or attack. She was trying to understand the boundaries of her new environment. A person didn't do that unless they expected to stay a while. To address what listeners might ask, how they would communicate beyond fragments of English, Elias decided to bridge the silence. "You speak English well enough," he said. "Learn it somewhere." Ayoka took a moment before answering. "Some traders teach, some soldiers. I listen. You understand more than you say," he observed gently. Ayoka nodded. "Hard to talk, hard to trust. It'll come when it needs to," he said. She gave him a small, cautious glance, the kind that carried gratitude but didn't know how to show it yet. Outside, the wind picked up. Elias moved to the door to check the horizon out of habit. The land stretched quiet and open, no dust trails or movement. He scanned the fence line where he'd first heard the creak the day before. It felt like weeks ago now. Ayoka put down her empty bowl and stood slowly. She walked toward the door, stopping beside him, but keeping a respectful distance. She looked at the land the way someone looks at a world they're not sure they're allowed to return to. "This your home?" she said. "It is," Elias replied. She studied his expression. "You live alone, long time?" "Long enough," he said. A question that had been left unanswered in previous chapters now surfaced. Why Elias chose isolation. Why he lived so far from town, from people. Ayoka didn't push, but he sensed her curiosity. "My brother died years back," he said quietly. "After that, crowds didn't sit right with me. Quiet was easier." Ayoka looked down. "I know that feeling. Empty place inside." He nodded. There was nothing else to say. They understood each other without forcing words. A sudden gust rattled the cabin door. Ayoka flinched, instinctively stepping back. Elias noticed immediately. "You think someone followed you," he said, not accusing, just recognizing the truth. She hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe. Raiders go many ways. Sometimes follow tracks. Sometimes no." He could hear the concern beneath her controlled tone. The unresolved question, were the raiders near, could no longer be ignored. "We'll check the land together," Elias said. "After you rest a bit more. You know what signs to look for. You might see things I miss." Ayoka's eyes widened a little, not in fear, but in something closer to surprise. He wasn't treating her as a burden. He was treating her as someone capable, someone with knowledge, someone useful. That mattered. "I help," she said firmly. "I not hide. I help." "I know," he replied. "And I'm not keeping you inside this cabin like you're trapped. Just want to keep you breathing." Ayoka took in the words slowly, letting them settle in her chest. "You different," she whispered. "Other men want something, or want trade. I'm not other men," Elias said simply. "You're here because you need to be. That's all there is to it." She nodded again, more sure this time. Later that afternoon, they stepped outside together. Ayoka kept her blanket around her shoulders, but walked with purpose. Elias let her lead, showing her the property piece by piece. She observed the land sharply, testing tracks, checking tree lines, listening for distant movement. She wasn't just cautious, she was skilled. She had lived her whole life reading open country. "That print," she said, pointing to a faint indentation near the fence. "Old. 2 days. Not raiders." Elias knelt beside her, studying the ground. "How do you know?" She pointed to the depth, the shape, the direction. "Travelers. Not fast. Not many." He felt something shift. They were no longer strangers trapped in the same space. They were people working together, relying on the strengths of the other. Practical survival had replaced uncertainty. When they finished surveying the land, they returned to the cabin. Ayoka seemed calmer now. She walked inside without that initial hesitation, like the place was unfamiliar but no longer threatening. "You stay inside tonight," Elias said. "Storm's coming." She looked out the window at the darkening sky. "You stay too?" "Yeah," he said. "I stay." Her posture eased. "You keep watch," she murmured softly. "Like family." The word struck him harder than he expected. He didn't respond, but the silence between them carried its own meaning. By nightfall, Ayoka settled onto the cot again, less tense than before. Elias remained near the door with his rifle nearby. Not because he expected trouble that night, but because he knew she needed to see him ready, steady, and present. The storm rolled in, rattling the windows and shaking the roof lightly. But for the first time since she arrived, Ayoka didn't watch the door with fear. She watched the fire. She watched Elias, not because she trusted him fully, but because she believed he would not abandon her. For now, that was enough. The storm lasted through most of the night, pounding against the cabin roof with a steady rhythm that made sleep difficult for anyone carrying worry in their chest. Elias stayed awake longer than he intended, listening for anything unusual beneath the wind. Ayoka drifted in and out of sleep, tense at every loud gust, but each time her eyes opened, she saw Elias sitting in the same place near the door. His presence steadied her nerves, though she didn't say it out loud. By morning, the rain had thinned into a damp mist clinging to the trees. The ground outside glistened with puddles, and a gray haze covered the horizon. Elias set a pot on the stove, heating what little coffee he had left. When he turned, he found Ayoka already awake, sitting upright, her hair tangled from sleep, but her gaze sharp and alert. "You didn't rest much," Elias said. She shook her head. "Storm loud. Memory loud, too." He understood. Storms had a way of dragging old fears to the surface. He poured a small tin cup of coffee and placed it near her. "It's bitter," he warned, "but warm." Ayoka took a sip, her face tightening slightly at the taste. "Strong," she murmured. "It does the job." They shared a quiet moment, and Elias noticed something new. Ayoka wasn't clinging to the blanket as tightly. She still kept it around her shoulders, but her posture was more controlled, less defensive. The earlier chapters had hinted at the need to address how their living arrangement would evolve, who handled which tasks, and how they navigated unspoken rules of shared space. Now was the natural point to clarify those uncertainties without forcing awkwardness. I'll check the land again, Elias said. After the storm, tracks show clearer. If anyone's been close, we'll know. Ayoka nodded. I come too. I see signs. You sure? He asked, watching her carefully. Your side's not healed. I walk slow, she said. But I walk. It was important to her. She didn't want to sit inside and feel helpless. Elias respected that. They stepped outside into the cool, damp air. Ayoka moved with caution but determination. Her blanket exchanged for one of Elias's heavier coats. It hung loosely on her frame, but it kept her warm. She walked beside him, not behind him. Not because she felt equal yet, but because she didn't want to be protected blindly. She wanted to face whatever danger existed with clear eyes. The land was quiet except for dripping branches. Mist rose from the creek, turning the edges of the forest into a pale curtain. They moved slowly along the fence line, scanning the mud. Elias expected to see only the tracks of their own horses or perhaps a stray deer. Instead, Ayoka stopped suddenly. Here, she said, pointing at a section of churned mud near the tree-line. Elias crouched immediately. There were hoof prints, 3, maybe 4 different horses. Deep prints made by animals carrying weight. The direction was toward the North Ridge, a route raiders often used to skirt ranch land without being seen. These tracks fresh? Elias asked. Ayoka knelt beside him, studying the edges of the prints with a practiced eye. She touched the mud lightly, feeling the moisture. Storm came late night. These before rain, but not far before. Maybe sunset, maybe little more. Elias felt a subtle shift in his stomach. Not fear exactly, but a tightening of responsibility. They came close, he murmured. Ayoka set her jaw. Raiders look for people, or horses, or easy place to take food. Her voice held a quiet dread, fear mixed with experience. Elias stood and scanned the land, calculating distances and risks. They didn't come to the cabin, he said. If they did, they'd have left signs. They come again, she whispered. Raiders no give up. This was another question listeners might ask from earlier chapters. How much danger were they truly in? And what would Elias decide now that his land had been crossed by men she feared? He turned to her. You think they're hunting you? Ayoka looked torn for a moment. She didn't want to believe she was the cause of danger to his home. Maybe, she said quietly. Maybe they look for anyone. Hard to know. Elias watched her struggle with the guilt of possibly drawing danger towards someone who had shown her nothing but respect. You didn't bring this trouble, he said firmly. Men like that don't need a reason to ride near a ranch. They drift like wolves. Could have happened whether you were here or not. Ayoka lowered her head. It was clear she didn't fully believe him, but she appreciated the attempt to ease her burden. They continued walking the property until Elias had a full picture. The raiders hadn't entered the main yard. They hadn't circled the barn. They had kept to the outer edge, likely scouting the land for easy access. When they returned to the cabin, Ayoka stepped inside, but didn't sit. I leave, she said suddenly, her voice quiet but certain. If I go, they no follow you. Elias turned sharply, stunned by how quickly she'd made the decision. You're not going anywhere. You help me, she said. I not bring danger to your home. Ayoka, he said, his voice steady. If you walk out there injured, you won't last an hour. And you sure as hell won't stop raiders from crossing this land again. They don't care who's here. She looked away, anguish tightening around her eyes. I make trouble, she whispered. You're not trouble, Elias said, stepping closer but stopping before he crossed the invisible line she kept between them. Listen to me. You didn't ask for this. You didn't cause it. You're just trying to stay alive. Her breathing quickened, as if she were fighting the instinct to run. Even here, even now. Elias lowered his voice. You leaving won't protect me. Staying won't endanger me. But walking out there alone, that'll kill you. Ayoka swallowed hard, emotions tightening her throat. You keep watch, she said. All night. Because of me. I keep watch because it's smart, Elias corrected. Not because I regret having you here. She finally met his eyes. The conflict inside her was clear, wanting safety, wanting to protect him, wanting to disappear, and wanting to stay, all wrestling for control. After a long moment, she whispered, "I stay." "For now." "That's enough," Elias said. She sank onto the cot, exhausted, not from the walk, but from carrying the weight of her decisions. Elias sat by the door again, checking his rifle, securing the latch, and planning the next steps. This answered another lingering question. How would they prepare? What would they do if danger returned? "Tomorrow," Elias said, "we start strengthening the barn door and patching the fence. We'll keep this place tight. If anyone comes close, we'll know before they reach us." Ayoka nodded slowly. "I help," she said. "I work." "I know," he replied softly, "and I won't stop you." For the first time, she didn't look like someone waiting to flee. She looked like someone beginning to belong. The threat outside had grown clearer, but so had the quiet bond forming inside the cabin. And neither of them would face what came next alone. The following morning brought a clearer sky and a colder wind. The storm had washed the air clean, leaving the land sharp and quiet in a way that made every sound stand out. Elias stepped outside first, checking the yard with practiced caution. Ayoka followed a few minutes later, her steps slow but steady. She wore his spare coat again, its sleeves too long for her arms, but it kept her warm enough to move around without shivering. They had agreed the night before to strengthen the property and prepare for the possibility of raiders returning. But there were still unanswered questions from earlier chapters. How would they divide tasks? How would Ayoka cope physically? And how would they adapt to functioning together rather than side by side? Chapter 6 needed to resolve how their partnership formed in practical, believable ways. Elias pointed to the section of the fence nearest the tree line. "Storm cracked the post again. Not good if someone tries to slip through. We'll fix that first." Ayoka nodded. She didn't hesitate the way she had before. The fear that once controlled her steps had shifted into focus. She was ready to help. They walked toward the fence, carrying tools Elias had gathered the night before. Ayoka held a coil of wire while Elias carried the mallet and replacement posts. She moved carefully, pain still tugging at her ribs, but she didn't complain. "You sure you're up for this?" Elias asked. She glanced at him with a faint, determined look. "I work. I not stay inside and shake." He respected that. She needed purpose as much as she needed food or rest. They reached the fence, and Elias set down the tools. Ayoka knelt beside him, inspecting the damaged post. "Store break," she said softly. "Or animal push." "Storm," Elias replied. "Too even. Animal would have splintered one side." Ayoka nodded, studying the earth the way she had the day before. She brought a level of attention he rarely saw in anyone. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival instinct sharpened over years. Elias realized then that she wasn't simply a frightened woman running from danger. She was someone raised to read land the way others read books. They worked in slow, rhythmic steps. Elias drove the new post into the ground while Ayoka held it steady, her fingers gripping the wood firmly despite the pain. They tightened wire, hammered nails, and packed soil. The work was simple but grounding. Neither spoke much, but the silence wasn't tense anymore. It was cooperative. When they finished, Ayoka leaned against the fence post for a moment, catching her breath. Elias noticed the strain in her face. "You pushing yourself too hard," he said. She shook her head. "If raiders come, I need strength. I need not be weak." "You're not weak," he replied. She met his eyes, searching for signs of pity. She found none. That seemed to matter to her more than anything. They made their way back to the cabin for a short break. Elias poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She drank quietly, eyes drifting toward the tree line again. "They come from that way last time," she murmured. "My band walked valley. Raiders wait on high ground. You think they're circling this area?" Elias asked. "Yes," she said. "Raiders no stay one place. They look for signs, smoke, tracks, easy people." "Good thing they don't know what kind of people live here," Elias replied with a dry tone. Ayoka almost smiled, small, fleeting but real. Another unspoken question needed addressing. Why she believed Elias's land would draw raiders, and why she hadn't considered seeking help from a fort or reservation. She answered it before he even asked. "Soldiers no help us," she said quietly. "Sometimes soldiers take two. Sometimes they trade us for peace." Elias looked down, jaw tightening. He knew enough about the politics on the frontier to know she wasn't exaggerating. Safety wasn't guaranteed for her anywhere except where someone chose to protect her. The only reason you're here, Elias said, is because I want you safe, not because of some deal or promise. Ayoka stared at him, unsure how to respond. Trust wasn't something she could give easily, but his words landed with more weight than he expected. After their break, they spent the afternoon reinforcing the barn. Elias hammered a new iron bolt through the main door, while Ayoka checked the gaps near the back wall. She ran her fingers along the wooden planks, stopping where she felt a breeze slip through. Here, she said. Cold comes in, and smell travels. Smell? Elias asked. Ayoka nodded. Men who hunt smell horses. Easy find. Good eye, he said, moving to block it. Together, they patched the gap with spare boards and a strip of hide. A simple fix, but enough to stop drafts and reduce the chance of animals and people tracking them too easily. By late afternoon, Ayoka was visibly drained. Elias insisted they rest, but she shook her head. One more, she said, pointing toward the far side of the barn. I see something earlier. Curious, Elias followed her. She knelt near a patch of wet earth. At first, Elias saw nothing. Then she brushed away the top layer of mud, revealing a faint footprint, too large to be hers, too fresh to ignore. Someone came close, she whispered. Elias crouched beside her, his chest tightening. This wasn't here yesterday. No, she said. Night, before storm heavy. His thoughts raced, but he kept his voice steady. Do they see you? Or the cabin? No, she said. Maybe just pass. Maybe look. Looking is enough, Elias muttered. The threat had grown from a possibility into a near certainty. Someone had approached the barn, far enough from the cabin to scout, close enough to mean trouble. Ayoka stood, fear tightening around her features, but she didn't panic. She turned toward Elias, her voice firm. We prepare more. We not run. You want to stay? He asked. Yes, she said without hesitation. Running no help. Running make me die. Here, she looked at him with steady eyes. Here better. Her conviction surprised him. For someone who had lived through raids, loss, and days of terror, choosing to stay, even in danger, meant she saw something in this place worth holding on to. Elias nodded slowly. Then we prepare. They returned to the cabin as the sun began to set. Ayoka sat on the cot, breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. Elias checked the rifle and set a second lantern near the window. The preparations were simple but deliberate, a quiet confirmation that neither of them was facing the coming danger alone. As the sky darkened, Ayoka finally spoke. You help me because you good man? Elias looked at her for a long moment. I help you because you deserve to be safe. That's all. And because he paused, choosing his words carefully. Because I don't want to live in a world where someone like you has to fight alone. Ayoka lowered her gaze, but not to hide fear. This time, it was something closer to gratitude. She lay down, and he took his place near the door again. Outside, the land grew still in a way that meant something was waiting. But inside the cabin, for the first time, neither of them felt truly alone. They were preparing not out of fear, but out of a shared determination to survive together. Night settled over the ranch with a tense stillness that felt heavier than the storm before it. Elias kept the lantern dim, letting the glow spread just enough to light the room without making the cabin a target. Ayoka lay awake on the cot, staring at the ceiling, her breathing shallow and careful. She didn't speak, but Elias knew she sensed the same thing he did. The land was too quiet. Quiet in a way that suggested someone was listening. There were lingering questions from the earlier chapters that needed answering now. Would there be a fight? Would the raiders come for Ayoka? How would Elias protect the ranch without turning the story into a gunfight-heavy tale? Chapter 7 needed to resolve the threat realistically, without breaking the grounded tone. Late in the night, Elias finally stood from the chair near the door. You should try to sleep, he said softly. Ayoka shook her head. I listen. Elias didn't argue. He respected that she wanted control over her own fear. He cracked the door open and stepped outside to scan the yard. The wind had died completely. Not a branch moved. No insects. No horses shifting in the barn. No creak sounds from beyond the trees. Just a thick, unmoving silence. He walked to the edge of the porch and crouched, studying the ground the way Ayoka had taught him. Even in the dim light, he could tell something had changed. Fresh impressions in the dirt. Not close enough to be a direct threat, but close enough to confirm someone had passed through recently. We stepped back inside. Ayoka was already sitting upright. "You hear something?" she asked. "Not yet," Elias said, but someone was near the edge of the yard. Probably last night. Maybe scouting. Ayoka's jaw tightened. Raiders move quiet. Look for weak place. They won't find one here, he answered. But he knew they needed a plan, something that avoided violence but kept the raiders away. He had no interest in killing anyone, and Ayoka didn't need more blood in her life. "We'll use the land," Elias said. "They don't know how this place works." "We do." Ayoka looked confused at first, then listened carefully. Elias showed her a rough outline on the table using small stones and a piece of wire. "If they come from the North Ridge," he explained, "they'll hit the fence we fixed yesterday. If they come from the west, the creek cuts off their trail. If they go east, they'll get stuck in the ravine." "They follow easiest path," Ayoka said, understanding. "Toward the barn." Elias nodded. "Exactly. And that's where we'll make it look like 3 or 4 men are guarding the place." Ayoka stared at him, realization slowly dawning. "You trick them. That's the plan." Instead of waiting for danger to strike, they spent the early dawn setting the ranch to look defended. Elias hammered an extra lantern hook outside the barn and hung a second lamp there, making it seem like someone was on watch. Ayoka tied one of his coats to a post inside the corral, so it moved like a silhouette in the wind. They placed 2 old rifles in the windowsill at angles that suggested someone was aiming out. Elias even set up a rope line that rattled the tin pans by the woods if someone came too close. None of it involved gunfire. It was about presence, about convincing raiders that they weren't worth the trouble. Ayoka worked beside him without complaint, despite the pain that occasionally made her stop and hold her ribs. She didn't hide her limits today. She trusted Elias enough not to pretend. "You think it enough?" she asked, stepping back to look at the cabin's defenses. "It doesn't have to be perfect," Elias said. "Just enough to make them choose an easier target." She nodded, though the fear in her eyes didn't disappear. "Raiders sometimes stupid," she whispered. "Sometimes angry. Sometimes want revenge." Elias paused, then said gently, "You think they want revenge for you escaping?" Ayoka looked down. "Maybe. I kill one." He hadn't expected that answer. She spoke it with no pride, no shame, just fact. "He hurt my sister," she added quietly. "I take knife. I fight. I run." Elias inhaled sharply. The missing piece from earlier chapters, the exact reason she had escaped, fit into place. Not only had she fled danger, she had acted to save someone and paid for it with fear and weeks of running. "What happened to your sister?" Elias asked, voice gentle. Ayoka's eyes glistened. "She fall. No breathe. I not leave her until midnight. Then I go." Elias stepped closer, feeling the weight of her loss settle heavily in the air. "You did everything you could," he said quietly. "You didn't abandon her." Ayoka wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. "Raiders know I kill one. They hunt. Maybe they want finish." Elias shook his head. "They won't get close enough to find out who lives here. Not after tonight." Ayoka looked at him, her expression shifting. Not quite trust, but something very close. As night fell, they sat quietly in the dark cabin. The false silhouettes swayed in the yard. The lantern outside flickered like a watchman's lamp. From a distance, the ranch looked guarded by several men. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, just after midnight, faint hoofbeats echoed from the North Ridge. Elias and Ayoka froze. The sound was distant but real, slow, searching steps like riders sweeping the land for signs. Ayoka lowered herself to the floor near the wall, breathing shallowly. Elias moved beside her, rifle ready but rested across his knees. Not aimed, just prepared. The hoofbeats circled, then slowed, then stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing, no movement, no voices, only the faint rustle of wind against the barn door. Then a sudden shout split the night, followed by another voice, sharper, frustrated. Hooves thundered away, hurried and uneven, retreating toward the ridge. Ayoka's hand clutched Elias's sleeve. "They go," she whispered. "They go," Elias said. She exhaled shakily, her shoulders collapsing with relief. But she didn't let go of his sleeve. Elias didn't pull away. When the land grew silent again, Ayoka whispered, "You keep me alive." Elias looked at her in the dim light. "We keep each other alive." For the first time since she arrived, Ayoka leaned toward him, not in fear, but in trust so fragile he didn't dare move. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "I stay with you," she said, "not because I must, because I want." Outside, the ranch stood untouched. The danger had passed for now, and in the quiet that followed, something deeper than survival took root between them. They were no longer just a cowboy and a hunted woman. They were partners. And after tonight, nothing would break that bond. The hours after the raiders retreated were strangely quiet, as if the land itself was catching its breath. Elias and Ayoka stayed awake until the faintest blue touched the horizon, both of them listening for any sign that the danger might return. When it didn't, Elias finally set his rifle aside, and Ayoka allowed her hand to slip from his sleeve, though she stayed close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. Morning came slowly. The ranch looked untouched, the fall silhouettes still swaying in the breeze. The lantern outside burned out. For the first time in days, there was no tension coiled in Elias's shoulders. He let out a long, steady breath as he stepped out onto the porch, scanning the land with more confidence than caution. Ayoka followed him outside, wrapped in his coat. "They've gone far," she said, her voice still low, still testing the new safety. "Far enough they won't try again today," Elias replied. But there were still questions that listeners might ask, loose threads that needed to be tied. Would the raiders return? What was Ayoka planning now that the threat had passed? Did she intend to leave or stay permanently? And what did Elias truly feel about her presence? Chapter 8 needed to give shape to those answers. Ayoka walked toward the edge of the porch, looking over the land as though trying to understand where she now belonged in this wide, open place. Her hair was tangled from the long night, her face tired but calmer. "You think they come again?" she asked. "They might," Elias admitted. "But after last night, they'll think this place is defended. Raiders look for easy fights. This ranch isn't one." Ayoka nodded, absorbing the truth without trying to comfort herself with denial. She was brave in a practical way, never pretending things were better or worse than they were. Elias watched her as she studied the land. The dawn light touched her face, revealing not fear but decision. Something about her posture had changed. She wasn't standing like someone waiting to run anymore. She was standing like someone who had made a choice. "You don't have to leave," Elias said. Ayoka turned sharply, surprised by the directness of his words. "You want me to stay? I want you safe," Elias said, his voice steady. "And you're safer here than out there." Ayoka looked away, her expression tightening with emotion she couldn't quite name. "You saved me 2 times," she whispered. "Creek and raiders." "You save yourself first," Elias corrected. "I just helped where I could." She gave him a small, hesitant smile, the first genuine one since the night she arrived. "You help more than you say." A moment of silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, not uncertain. Just 2 people standing at the edge of something new and unspoken. Ayoka took a step toward the creek path. "I go there," she said. "Where you find me." Elias blinked. "You sure?" She nodded. "I need see place. Need breathe. I'll go with you." She shook her head gently. "No, I go alone. I come back." The last sentence held more meaning than she realized. Elias stayed on the porch while she walked down the worn path. He watched her until she disappeared into the trees, then leaned against the railing, trying to understand the knot in his chest. He wasn't worried she would run. He trusted her enough now to know she'd return. The knot came from something else, something he'd been trying not to name. When Ayoka reached the creek, The morning light hit the water with a calm that felt almost unreal after the fear of the night before. She stepped to the edge and crouched, touching the surface with her fingertips. The cold didn't shock her this time. It steadied her. This was where her life had changed, first with terror, then with the unexpected kindness of a stranger. She remembered how she had been shaking, how she had expected him to attack or take advantage. But he hadn't. Instead, he had stepped back. He had offered cloth. He had turned away. She whispered to the water, "You good man, Elias Ward." When she returned to the cabin, Elias was splitting wood near the barn. He stopped when he saw her, relief crossing his face in a way he didn't try to hide. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I think first time I breathed since running." He nodded. "Good." There was another question she had been carrying silently. One listeners might wonder too, why Elias had taken her in without hesitation, risking trouble and danger. She stepped closer, searching his eyes. "Why you help me?" "Many men no help Apache woman. Many men shoot first." Elias took a long breath, choosing honesty over comfort. "Because I've seen enough hurt in this world. Enough loss. I wasn't going to add to it. And because—" He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "You remind me what it feels like to have someone to protect. I haven't felt that in a long time." Ayoka looked down, overwhelmed. His answer wasn't romantic, wasn't dramatic. It was real, shaped by loneliness and quiet responsibility. "I stay," she said softly. "If you want." "I do." She breathed in slowly, her chest rising with relief she had been afraid to allow herself. The decision settled between them. Not forced, not fearful, but chosen. The rest of the day passed peacefully. They worked side by side repairing the barn roof, carrying logs, and reorganizing supplies. Their movements synced naturally, as if they had been doing this for months instead of days. That evening, they sat at the small table, sharing a meal without the tension that once filled the room. Ayoka placed her plate slightly closer to his, a gesture he noticed even if she pretended not to. Elias set his cup near hers, an unspoken acknowledgement. When she finished eating, Ayoka rested her palms on the table. "I want to help more. Not just hide. Not just heal." "You're already helping," Elias said. "No," she insisted gently. "I want work. I want belong." The last word weighed heavily, like something she wasn't sure she deserved. "You do belong," Elias said quietly, "and you could stay as long as you want." Ayoka lowered her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I stay." The decision settled them both. The fear that had once filled the cabin dissolved into something warmer, steadier. Outside, the moon rose above the ranch, lighting the land that had nearly become a battleground. Inside, for the first time since Ayoka arrived, the cabin felt like a home shared, not by necessity, but by choice. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And neither of them doubted that now. The next days unfolded with a calmness neither Elias nor Ayoka had expected. The fear that once lived in every corner of the cabin had faded into something steadier, something that felt almost like the beginning of a life rather than the aftermath of a chase. But there were still questions that needed closure. Would the raiders return? What future did they have together? How would Ayoka truly heal? And where would she belong? Chapter 9 needed to answer all of it and bring the story to a clear, satisfying end. Elias woke early as usual, but when he stepped outside, Ayoka was already by the corral, brushing one of the horses. She worked slowly, her movements careful, but growing more confident each day. It was the first time since she arrived that she'd touched one of the animals. When she saw Elias approaching, she didn't flinch or step back. She simply gave him a small, warm nod. "You're up early," Elias said. "Horses calm me," she replied. "In my home, horse is part of family." He paused beside her, leaning on the corral rail. "You miss your home?" She nodded, but her face didn't carry the same raw pain as before. "Yes, but home is not place only. Home is people." She said it softly, but the meaning wasn't soft at all. Elias swallowed, unsure how to respond. He wasn't a man good with words, and her honesty hit something inside him he had kept buried for years. After the horses were fed, they went to the fence line again. No new tracks, no signs of raiders, only the occasional deer print and the fading impressions from their own boots. Ayoka crouched, running her hand over the earth. Raiders gone, she said with certainty. They moved north. They no come back. You sure? Elias asked. Yes. Then she looked up with a stronger voice. They think many men live here. They fear fight. They leave. Her survival instincts had been sharp so far. Elias trusted her read more than his own. With the threat gone, the questions that once hovered over them became simpler. What now? Ayoka stood and wiped her hands on the coat. We fix barn, fix fence, fix roof, she said. Your home's strong. You help me live. Now, I help you live. Elias blinked. You don't owe me anything. She stepped closer, her expression firm but gentle. I stay because I choose, not because I owe. He nodded slowly, letting the truth of her words sink in. She wasn't staying out of fear or debt. She was staying because she wanted to. Together, they walked back to the cabin. Elias held the door open without thinking. Ayoka paused, studying the small gesture. You treat me like equal, she said. You are. Elias answered simply. Inside, they shared a quiet breakfast. Ayoka set her plate near his again, closer than before. Elias didn't move it. Their closeness had grown naturally, shaped by shared danger and shared silence, not forced or rushed. But one last lingering question remained for her. What was her future now that she was healed and safe? After breakfast, she stepped outside to gather herbs near the creek. Elias watched from the porch, giving her space. When she returned, she carried a small bundle of plants and sat beside him on the steps. I think about future, she said. Elias nodded once, his chest tightening. He tried to prepare himself for the possibility that she might choose to leave, to find her people, or settle somewhere safer. You thinking of going somewhere? He asked quietly. Ayoka looked at him with steady eyes. I have no band anymore. No family. Only memory. If I go alone. I die alone. Elias felt something twist inside him, a quiet ache mixed with relief that she was saying this out loud. And if you stay? He asked. Ayoka took a slow breath. If I stay, I live. I work. I help. And she hesitated, searching for the English words. And I'm not lonely. The simplicity of her honesty hit harder than any dramatic confession. Elias turned his gaze toward the open land, letting her words settle into the quiet morning. I'm not lonely when you're here, he finally said. Haven't been since the day I found you in that creek. Ayoka's eyes softened. She placed the small bundle of herbs beside her and folded her hands in her lap. You want me to stay for a long time? She asked, testing the future with careful hope. Long as you want, Elias replied. Long as this place feels like home. Ayoka took a deep breath, letting the tension that had lived inside her for weeks finally release. This is home, she said quietly. You are home. Elias felt the words settle deeper than he expected. Not dramatic, not grand, just true. Later that day, they worked on the roof, patching a section worn thin by the storm. Ayoka handed Elias wooden shingles and held beams steady while he hammered. At one point, she laughed, a small, surprise sound when he nearly dropped a nail. Elias paused, stunned by the simple, human warmth of her laughter. It was the first time he had heard it. He smiled, a quiet, genuine smile that felt unfamiliar but right. By evening, the roof was fixed, the barn secured, and the ranch once again felt like a place meant for living, not hiding. They ate dinner together, closer now than before. Ayoka rested her hand on the table between them, not touching his, but close enough that the distance was a choice she could end whenever she wished. After the meal, they stepped onto the porch as the sun set across the horizon. The sky glowed orange and gold, the land stretching quiet and peaceful before them. Ayoka leaned slightly toward him, not needing to hide her closeness anymore. You think future good here? She asked softly. I think it's the best future I ever had, Elias answered. She looked at him, then down at the land, then back at him. I stay, she said again, this time not as a question, not as uncertainty, but as a promise. Elias nodded, his voice low. Then we build something here together. Ayoka reached out slowly, touching his hand with her fingertips. Light, careful, but sure. He didn't pull away. He turned his hand over and let his fingers wrap gently around hers. No fear, no uncertainty, no running. Just two people who had survived enough pain for a lifetime finally finding a place and a person to stay with. The ranch grew quiet as night fell, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful, warm, shared. For the first time since both of their lives had been torn apart, they weren't just surviving. They were beginning, and their story ended not with a question, not with a chase, but with a choice. Ayoka and Elias choosing to stay, choosing each other, and choosing a future built on quiet loyalty and a home they claimed together.